Bob Sapp was once one of the most feared men in combat sports, a giant with freakish strength and an unstoppable force in K1, and pride his terrifying size and aggressive fighting style made him a global superstar, earning him fame, fortune, and opportunities beyond the ring. But behind the larger-than-life persona, Sapp's career took a dark and unexpected turn. Once a dominant force, he became a shell of his former self. Accused of throwing fights and losing simply for a paycheck now, at 51 years old, his life is far from the wealth and glory he once enjoyed, from financial ruin to health struggles and public ridicule. The story of Bob Sapp is not one of lasting success, but of a rise and fall that left him broken. This is the tragic reality of Bob Sapp today. Bob Sapp's life was never easy. Born on September 22, 1973 in Colorado, he was raised in a tough environment that shaped his relentless work ethic as a child. He was larger than most kids his age, and he quickly learned that his size could be both a blessing and a curse. Faced bullying and adversity, but instead of backing down, he turned to athletics as an escape. Football became his passion and his natural strength. And size made him a standout player in high school, determined to make something of himself. SAP earned a scholarship to the University of Washington, where he played as an offensive lineman. He thrived in college football, becoming a key part of the team and catching the attention of NFL scout. His hard work paid off when he was drafted by the Chicago Bears in 1997 for Sapp. It seemed like his dreams were finally coming true. He had reached the pinnacle of American sports, but the NFL wasn't kind to him after being drafted. SAP struggled to find his place. He bounced between teams, dealing with injuries and setbacks that kept him from ever playing in a regular season game. The brutal reality of professional football hit him hard. Just because you made it to the league didn't mean you'd stay there in a sport where, I'll say, only the strongest and most durable survive. SIP found himself on the outside looking in. He was eventually cut, his dreams of a long NFL career shattered with no contract and no stable income. Sapp was left searching for his next move he had built his entire identity around: football, and now without it, he was lost. Bills piled up and financial struggles became a harsh reality. But just when it seemed like he had nowhere to turn, an unexpected opportunity presented itself, one that would change his life forever. Japanese fight promoters saw something in Sapp that others didn't. To them, he wasn't just a failed football player, he was a physical specimen, a towering giant with an intimidating presence. At 6 feet 4 inches and over 300 pounds of muscle, he was larger than life, and the world of combat sports had a place for men like him. They invited him to compete in K1, Japan's premier kickboxing organization, and despite having no real martial arts experience, SAP accepted the challenge. In K1, SAP was thrown into the deep end, facing world-class kickboxers with far more experience. But what he lacked in skill, he made up for in raw power. In one of the most shocking upsets in combat sports history, he demolished Ernesto Hoost, a legendary multiple-time K1 champion, earning instant credibility and the attention of the world. Fans couldn't believe what they had witnessed. How could an inexperienced newcomer destroy a legend? Sapp's rise was meteoric. His terrifying aggression and brute force made him an overnight sensation in Japan. He wasn't just winning fights, he was crushing opponents in a way that had never been seen before. The Japanese audience, captivated by his massive physique and wild fighting style, embraced him as a superstar. He became a cultural icon, appearing in commercials, movies, and TV shows. Bob Sapp wasn't just a fighter, he was an entertainer, a larger-than-life figure who transcended combat sports. His success in K1 opened the door for an MMA career, where he quickly became a must-watch attraction in Pride Fighting Championships. He had some incredible moments, including his legendary war against Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, where he used his sheer size and power to ragdoll the Brazilian submission expert even in fights he lost. He put on spectacular performances that kept fans entertained for a time. It seemed like Bob Sapp had found his true calling. He had gone from an NFL reject to one of the most famous fighters in the world. The money poured in, and he was living a lifestyle most could only dream of. But success in combat sports is rarely permanent. And for Bob Sapp, the cracks in his empire would soon begin to show. His raw strength and aggression had carried him far, but as his competition improved, his weaknesses became glaringly obvious. Fighters who had once been terrified of his power began to adapt. They realized that if they could withstand the early storm, SAP would tire out. He lacked technical skills, and once his initial burst of energy was gone, he was vulnerable. Losses started to pile up, and his once feared reputation began to fade. Yet SAP continued to get booked, his name still sold tickets, and promoters knew people would pay to see him fight, win or lose. But instead of training harder and evolving as a fighter, Sapp took a different route. As the years went by, his performances became more and more questionable. He was no longer the monster who had crushed legend. Instead, he was falling in the first round. Seemingly giving up at first sign of trouble, fans started accusing him of throwing fights, and whispers of match fixing followed him wherever he went despite the criticism. SAP kept taking fights, cashing in on his name while his skills and reputation continued to decline. He fought well past his prime, suffering humiliating losses to fighters who wouldn't have stood against him in his early days. The man who had once been a terrifying force in combat sports had become a joke to many. A spectacle rather than a competitor. Financial troubles followed. Even though he had made millions in his prime, mismanagement and bad business decisions drained his wealth. Without a proper safety net, he found himself taking any fight offer that came his way, regardless of the risk. He had built his brand on being a monster now. At 51 years old, the reality was much different. The money was gone, the respect was gone, and all that remained was a broken man trying to stay relevant. Bob Sapp's story is one of extreme highs and devastating lows. He had the world at his feet, but somewhere along the way, he lost control of it all. What started as a redemption story, a man who found success after the NFL turned its back on him, soon became a tragic tale of wasted potential and painful decline. And as we dive deeper into his life today, we'll uncover just how far he has fallen. Bob Sapp went from being one of the scariest men in combat sports to a walking punchline. His sheer size and brute strength had once made him a nightmare for his opponents. As time went on, the cracks in his fighting style became impossible to ignore. Unlike elite fighters who refine their craft over time, SAP relied almost entirely on his raw power and aggression. Once fighters learned how to withstand his early attacks, his weaknesses were exposed and his fall from grace began. The first signs of trouble came when opponents stopped fearing him. In his prime, fighters would step into the ring, intimidated by his monstrous frame and overwhelming power. But as more skilled and disciplined opponents faced him, they realized his biggest flaw, his gas tank. If they could survive his first few minutes of wild aggression, Sapp would tire out, leaving himself completely defenseless. This strategy was put on full display in his MMA fights, particularly against technical fighters who could weather the storm. His legendary battle with Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira in Pride had already shown the world that SAP, despite his immense size, could be worn down in later fights. His weakness became even more glaring. Fighters like Mirko Krokov, Minato Nogueira, and Kazuyuki Fujita dismantled him, exposing the holes in his defense with every loss. His intimidating presence diminished in K1, where he had once shocked the world by defeating Ernesto Hust. The rematch told a different story. Hust, now prepared, methodically broke him down and made him quit as the losses piled up. Sapp's confidence began to crumble. He was no longer the unstoppable force that promoters and fans once saw him as. The beast had been tamed, but the most controversial aspect of SAP's downfall wasn't just his losses, it was the way he lost. As time went on, his performances became noticeably worse, almost bizarre. He would enter fights looking aggressive, but as soon as he got hit, he would fold. His fights ended in the first round, often in embarrassing fashion, with SAP seemingly giving up at the earliest sign of danger. Fans and analysts began accusing him of throwing fights, suggesting that he was no longer interested in competition, only in collecting a paycheck. The once feared warrior now had a reputation as a fighter who would take a dive for money. Some even speculated that promoters were paying him to lose in order to build up other fighters' reputations. Sapp denied the accusation, insisting that he was simply unable to handle the punishment anymore. But to the public, it was obvious that something had changed. Gone was the fiery aggression that had made him famous. Now it looked like he was stepping into the ring just to survive long enough to collect his check. Despite the backlash, SAP continued to get booked. His name alone was enough to sell tickets. Even if his fights were no longer competitive, promoters knew that people would still pay to see him fight, whether out of nostalgia, curiosity, or simply to witness the spectacle of his rapid defeats. His career became less about winning and more about being a sideshow attraction, a former monster now reduced to a caricature of his former self. While his in-ring performances declined, so did his financial stability. In his prime, Sapp was one of the highest-paid fighters in K1, and Pride, making millions from fights, endorsements, and TV appearances. He was a celebrity in Japan, starring in commercials, game shows, and even movie, but with fame came reckless spending. SAP lived a lavish lifestyle, spending freely on luxury items, expensive trips, and an entourage that drained his wealth. Like many fighters who rise to fame quickly, he assumed the money would keep coming, but as his reputation declined, so did his earning potential. Bad financial decisions coupled with his declining fight purses left him struggling to maintain his once glamorous lifestyle without a solid financial plan or long-term investments. SAP found himself in a position where he had to keep fighting, even when his body and mind were no longer up to the task. His downfall wasn't just physical, it was financial and personal. The man who had once been a global superstar was now just another washed up fighter taking any fight offer that came his way, no matter how humiliating. What made SAP's story so tragic was that he had the tools to build a lasting legacy. He could have used his fame to transition into other ventures, such as coaching, commentary, or business. But instead, he kept chasing short-term paydays, further damaging his reputation and his health. The beast that had once terrorized the fight world had become a joke. Fans who once admired him now mocked him. The respect he had earned through his early victories had vanished. His fights became nothing more than viral moments, clips of him quitting, circling the internet as a reminder of how far he had fallen. Bob Sapp's descent from fear, the feared warrior, to cautionary tale was a painful reminder of what happens when an athlete fails to plan for life. After the spotlight fades, his story wasn't just about losing fights, it was about losing everything that had made him great. Fighting isn't forever, and for Bob Sapp, the realization came too late. At one point, he was one of the highest-paid combat sports athletes in the world, earning millions through fights, sponsorships, and television appearances. But as his fighting ability declined and the losses piled up, the money dried up just as quickly as his once-feared reputation. Despite making a fortune in his prime, SAP's financial situation spiraled downward. He had lived a lavish lifestyle, spending freely on luxury items, expensive vacations, and maintaining an entourage that drained his wealth. He made the mistake that so many fighters before him had made, believing the money would never stop coming. When the big fight purses disappeared, he had little to fall back on without major endorsements or a solid business plan. Sapp had no alternative revenue streams. Once his credibility as a fighter was gone, he didn't transition into coaching or commentary like other retired fighters. He had built his brand on being an unstoppable monster. But once that illusion faded, so did his opportunity. Instead of finding a new path, Sapp continued taking fights, not because he wanted to compete, but because he needed the paycheck. But these weren't real fights anymore. The Bob Sapp that once terrified opponents was long gone. He became a spectacle, a man booked solely to lose, taking dives in the fights across the world for quick cash. The once mighty beast had been reduced to a sideshow act, willing to step into the ring, throw a few punches, and fall at the first sign of trouble. Fans who once respected him now mocked him. Social media was flooded with clips of Sapp barely putting up a fight, dropping to the mat after taking the weakest of punches. He was no longer the powerful force that had taken down Ernesto Huasteco or given Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira a legendary war. He was now a punchline. The man people watched not to see him win, but to see how quickly he would give up. The damage wasn't just financial, it was physical. The years of punishment had caught up with him. His massive frame, once sculpted and intimidating, started to deteriorate. The power that had made him feared was gone, replaced by stiffness, joint problems, and chronic pain. His body had been through years of brutal fights, taking shots from world-class strikers and grapplers, and it showed multiple concussions, lingering injuries, and the wear and tear of hundreds of rounds of sparring and competition left Sapp in constant pain. Unlike fighters who had transitioned out of the sport with a plan, he had no proper medical support, no structured recovery, and no financial safety net to afford the best treatment. Fighters like Floyd Mayweather or George St. Pierre had set themselves up for life after fighting, ensuring they could retire comfortably. But Sapp, despite earning millions, had not prepared for the inevitable getting old in a sport that doesn't care about its fallen warriors. Without long-term medical care, Sapp's body has continued to break down. He moves slower, his speech is sometimes slurred, and the energy that once made him larger than life is fading. While he still makes occasional appearances in the media, the enthusiasm is gone. The man who once played the role, all of an unstoppable force, now looks like he's carrying the weight of every fight he ever took. One of the saddest realities of Bob Sapp's situation is that he still takes fights even today at 51 years old. He doesn't fight because he believes he can win. He fights because he needs the money. The sport that once made him rich and famous has now become a prison, forcing him to take humiliating losses just to survive. This is a painful but all too common story. In combat sports, fighters give everything to the sport, but when their time is up, the sport gives them nothing in return. Sapp's downfall isn't just about the losses. It's about what happens when a fighter has no exit strategy, unlike boxing legends who continue to earn millions through promotions, exhibitions, and smart business moves. Sapp's reputation was damaged beyond repair. Fans didn't want to see him as a coach, a trainer, or a commentator. They only knew him as a man who once terrified opponents, but was now barely fighting back. And in the brutal world of combat sports, once the audience turns on you, it's nearly impossible to regain their respect for Sapp. The reality was clear. He had been used by the sport, and when he was no longer useful, he was discarded, once a star in Japan, once a feared warrior in Pride. And K1, once a man with global recognition, he was now just another cautionary tale. Bob Sapp's story is a tragic reminder that in combat sports, fighters are often left with nothing. Once their prime is over, the money disappears, the fans move on, and the damage to the body and mind remains forever. And for Bob Sapp, the man who once stood as a giant in the fight world, all has been harder than anyone could have imagined. Bob Sapp wasn't just losing in the ring, he was losing in life. The respect, the friendships, and even the fans that once cheered for him had all disappeared. He became a man trapped in the image of his past, forced to keep fighting even when there was nothing left to fight for. At the height of his fame, SAP was surrounded by people, managers, trainers, business partners, and so-called friends who were eager to be part of his success. He was larger than life, not just physically, but in personality. As well, he played the role of the unstoppable monster, and for a while he truly was one. But as the losses mounted, so did the distance between him and those who once stood by his side. Financial troubles were the first blow to his personal relationships as the money ran out. The people who had once benefited from his success disappeared, the entourage that followed him in his K1 and Pride days, the sponsors that once lined up to feature him in commercial, and even some of the trainers who helped build his career all distanced themselves. The financial and legal troubles that followed only made things worse. Reports surfaced of unpaid debts, disputes over contracts, and lawsuits over failed business ventures without a stable income. And with his credibility as a fighter in question, he found himself more and more isolated. Once an in-demand personality in Japan and the US, his offers dried up, and the lucrative opportunities that once seemed endless vanished. Overnight, beyond the financial struggles, there was an even deeper battle, one of identity. Sapp had built his career on being the beast, the monster that could destroy anyone in his path. But as his reputation declined, he was forced to confront a harsh reality. The world no longer saw him as that monster. He was no longer feared, no longer respected, and in the eyes of many fans, no longer relevant. This identity crisis weighed heavily on him. Fighters are often defined by their success in the ring, and for SAP, the decline was not just physical, but emotional. He struggled to maintain the larger-than-life persona that had made him famous, but deep down, he knew that the image was shattered. The aggression that once defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow performance both inside and outside the ring. Perhaps the most painful part of App's downfall was the backlash from the very fans who once idolized him in the early 2000s. He was a global sensation, a man who could sell out arenas and bring millions of viewers to a fight. But by the late 2000s and into his 50s, he had become a meme, a fighter that fans watched not for inspiration but for entertainment in a different way. Mocking his rapid defeats and effortless falls, social media was especially ruthless. Clips of his fights circulated endlessly, showing him collapsing at the first sign of contact. Fans accused him of faking fights, calling him a disgrace to combat sports. He was no longer the beast he was. The man who gave up, the fighter who no longer fought. The media too turned on him. Once the subject of exciting headlines about his K1 and Pride dominance, he was now featured in articles ridiculing his performances. Journalists and analysts questioned whether he had any passion left for fighting or if he was simply cashing in on his past name value. Even fellow fighters, some of whom had once respected him, began openly criticizing him. Some called him the biggest fraud in combat sports, saying he had destroyed his own legacy by continuing to fight in such a disgraceful manner. Others said he was tarnishing the reputation of the very sport that had made him famous. Promoters still booked him, knowing he would lose. But his presence in combat sports became more of an embarrassment than an attraction. Among the most heartbreaking aspects of SAP's decline was the fact that he had no real place in the sport anymore. Unlike other aging fighters who transitioned into coaching, commentary, or business, he had burned too many bridges. He had lost the respect of his peers, and there were no opportunities waiting for him outside of the humiliating fights he continued to accept for a man who had once been on top of the world. This was a brutal fall from grace. He wasn't just losing fight, he was losing himself. The respect that he had worked so hard to earn was gone, and with each fight he accepted, his legacy crumbled even further. But Bob Sapp's story serves as a painful reminder of what happens when a fighter outstays his welcome. The sport that once embraced him had turned its back on him. The fans who once cheered for him had become his harshest critics, and the identity he had built over the years had been shattered beyond repair. Now, at 51 years old, Bob Sapp is no longer the feared warrior he once was. He is a man fighting ghosts, the ghost of his past success, the ghost of his former strength, and the ghost of a career that could have been so much more. He is trapped in a cycle that he cannot escape, still stepping into the ring, still playing the role of a fighter even when there is nothing left to fight for.